this is the most pressing question, I think, increasingly of the day. You know, where is this economy going? Are we out of recession? I mean, the NEBR ruled the other day that the recession ended last year, but we may be in for another recession, which it won't count as the same recession. But for most people, it still feels like we haven't really, in America at least, got out of that first recession. We have a panel here of people who bring a variety of different perspectives to the question of, you know, where are we heading both here and globally as an economy? What needs to be done to get more robust growth, to avoid a double dip or whatever? Several of these people are no doubt going to replace Larry Summers as chief advisor to the president at any moment. What should they be telling him, telling the president if they were to get that call as to what they would do to revive the economy? And I'm just going to go in the order of speakers that we have here. And so I'm going to ask my good friend Mark Angelson, who is a real businessman, to give that business perspective on, you know, what you see going on and what needs to happen, Mark.
Thank you, Matthew. What I see going on is easy. What needs to happen is a more difficult question, as you know. What I see going on is what I regard as the new normal, if you will. We've stabilized. We looked into the abyss. We didn't fall into the abyss. Kudos to those who worked 24 hours a day for months and months and months to make sure that didn't happen. The financial system did not collapse. We had a recession. It appears to be over. We have now an economy which is bumping along, and I'll overstate this just to stress the point. It's moving sideways, if you will. It moves up a little, it moves down a little, but it's basically going like this, and may do so for an indefinite period of time. I'm not an economist. I am a businessman. I understand that some stimuli have been applied and some more may be coming. I think what we have here is a situation not unlike 1938, and I hope that we find a better way than was found a few years after 1938 to get ourselves out of it.
Yeah, well, that's certainly an optimistic opening. Let's hope we can avoid World War III. Is that your message for us?
That's most of it.
I mean, the question is often put, and I wrote about it for this week's Economist, that, you know, Obama is anti-business. I talked to businessman after businessman, Republican, Democrat, and there's this kind of sense that the administration isn't doing the right things here, that he doesn't get it, that there's something missing. Do you share that view? And, you know, what should Obama be doing, do you think?
I do not share that view. I read widely, for example, that the president's chief of staff is also anti-business. I spent yesterday, and not on purpose, but part of early this morning in Chicago because of the lightning storms in New York last night. And on the front page of the Chicago Tribune this morning, there's a large photograph of Rahm Emanuel, and he's identified in the text as the candidate of business, if you will. So things change very quickly. I think we have a president who inherited a situation where there was precious little room for error. I believe that with the benefit of hindsight, there are some things that could have been done better over the last couple of years, but I think we have an able and sincere and brilliant president who is responding to these unknown waters as well as has been possible up until now.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Joseph Aiello. The president's announced a huge infrastructure fund, which I guess must be pleasing for your business side to anything else. But how do you look at that from that infrastructure perspective at how the world is, the economy is going, how this economy here is going?
Sure. Well, we look at the marketplace through the prism of our very, very narrow space in it, which is investing in public infrastructure. And I'd like to add on to the observation of the Obama administration and business friendly and not business friendly. We were in the cusp of a major project, multi-billion-dollar project in Miami, just as the Obama administration was coming into power at the beginning of 2009. And even during a transition period, when they're still trying to sort things through, they really broke every rule that existed to try to make sure that the project got financed through some of the tools that are available to the federal government. They have consistently been at the forefront on lending programs and credit programs and the kinds of things that states and municipalities need. So our observation from an infrastructure perspective, they've been very effective, and our business is actually pretty good. When we look at the investment in roads and bridges and transit systems, we're quite happy with what we see there.
And how much difference is this fund that's been announced going to make, do you think, this big infrastructure fund? This big $50 billion fund that the president has talked about?
The infrastructure bank. Yeah. It ought to be very helpful, but I think it's more of an aggregation and expansion of tools that they already have. So I think part of it is politics, but if you think about programmatically what's there, it really calls for an expansion of the Build America bonds, the private activity bonds, the TIFIA lending programs, the ability to have these things available more predictably, more stably over the long term than what they've been doing today. So whether or not they get it in a big package called the infrastructure bank, or whether or not they do this thing incrementally, I think the market would be indifferent to that.
And in terms of the impact of the kind of work you're doing on infrastructure, do you see there being the right sort of projects being done that are going to generate a lot of job growth in America, or is it too narrow a focus to really make that much difference?
Infrastructure investment is still done at the local level. I don't think that's a tradition that will change. The federal government's role really is to encourage types of investment, but these things are done very, very locally. Whether you have a Democratic president or Republican president, I don't think it changes the character of that. A lot of public involvement, a lot of regulatory, environmental protections, public realm protections. And I think that's just the realities of the U.S. market.
So Donald Marron, you're at the Brookings Urban Institute. Give us your perspective as someone who's taking a sort of more academic perspective on this.
Well, so obviously the United States faces an enormous number of challenges. There's just the classic conflict you always face about worrying about the near term versus worrying about the long run. One of the things that's nice about being in the academic think tank world is I can think occasionally about the long run, and I find it very scary for the United States, right? So, clearly there are things we need to do to provide additional stimulus to the economy to keep things going, but when you look out, 5, 10, 15 years in the future, we're on a trajectory that doesn't work. And then at some point in Washington, we need an opportunity and some leverage for folks to come together and try to address those issues in advance of them turning into a crisis.
So what for you are the priorities then we ought to be looking at the moment?
So for me, in the long run, I think the priorities are that, first of all, the tax system of the United States is fundamentally broken, that it's inefficient, that it inhibits growth in the US, it doesn't raise enough revenue, and then in principle you could take a hatchet to it, take out all the special exemptions, all the Swiss cheese holes, and have a much better designed tax system that would allow lower rates, would allow us to have lower rates on corporations, encourage growth, encourage activity here, while simultaneously, raising what will probably be more revenue needs in the future. And then obviously you have to pair that with spending restraint. Look at all of the various parts of the federal government, and while entitlements, Social Security, Medicare tend to get most of the headlines, I think really we need to go back and look at defense, look at other parts of the budget and give them a close look, that there's a lot of potential to do things there. But while we do those things, the vision is to attack those things before they become a problem, before they become more of a problem. But not lose sight of the fact that the economy is still weak and that we should be thinking about things to do. I personally lean more towards the camp that I would like to see the Federal Reserve do more, and less that the fiscal side would. But a combination of those two would also make sense.
Now, Richard Robb, as an investor and someone in the commodities sector, does the world look very different to you from what we've heard so far?
Well, let me start by following up on Mark's analogy to 1938. In the Depression, when we had 30% loss of output compared to 2.9% in this last recession, which is what it was. It was in many ways an ordinary sort of recession. Then that was followed by years of 10% growth, very tight monetary policy in order to keep the faith in the dollar, balanced budgets, tariffs, the Dust Bowl, many factors that we're not experiencing this time. And then 38, 39 became the double dip. And I think it's quite a different episode that we're facing right now. So, you know, I would have to say that I'm impressed with what the Federal Reserve has done. And there's a limit. You know, monetary policy can't solve every problem. And we've had remarkably stable prices. And quantitative easing has done what it was supposed to do from what I can see. And we talk about the loss of 6 million jobs. Okay, well, we've lost 106 million jobs, and we gained 100 million jobs. It's a very dynamic economy, which, if we don't lose our nerve, just as we did in let's say, '82, which I think is a very nice example for where we are right now, you know, we muddled through in the early '80s, and I don't see why it's going to look any different this time. It wasn't the kind of growth that one would expect after a recession, but neither was the recession, you know, 2/4 of 5% decline, again looking very much like '82. Some of the growth I will say is a bit disappointing, but not off the charts compared to historic experience.
I mean, the cover story we put on the latest issue of The Economist is this picture of a car heading off along a very long road through the desert with "Are we there yet?" as the question, asking about the economic recovery. And the argument that our team made about this recovery and why it's so slow and painful is that fundamentally the kind of shock that caused this recession was a very different sort of economic shock to most of those downturns, certainly since the 1930s, in terms of, you know, it was more of a financial heart attack than a over-aggressive monetary policy, and that therefore we've got to expect a much slower trajectory. It could be 3 or 4 years before we start to see unemployment come down.
I think the financial heart attack in the '30s, though, losing all the banks, is, in a way, it's got to be worse than losing.
Right. So at least we
losing countrywide.
We didn't actually let the whole banking system. Once Paulson realized that he was about to repeat the 1930s, he did change tack. But still, you know, fundamentally, there's a deleveraging that needs to go on in the economy, and the process of deleveraging, you know, is going to have a very slowing effect on, you know, the return of consumer spending, the kind of growth rates that you see. So, you know, whereas after a monetary-induced downturn, you tend to get a very rapid growth in the next couple of years, sort of 6–8% a year in America. This time, you know, 2.5% a year for 4 or 5 years will probably be quite successful.
Well, let's look at consumption. Okay, households have deleveraged. I mean, they've deleveraged in the sense that household borrowings have been unchanged for the last 3 years after. Since between 1985 to 2007, they're up between 8 and 14% a year. It's extraordinary, the leveraging of the U.S. households. Unchanged for the last 3 years, but it's been offset by government leverage, almost 1 for 1. And, you know, we have seen retail sales growing at about 2% annually for the last year, since the NBER discovered that the recession ended in the middle of last year, which is somewhat obvious. There's no evidence that I can see that consumption has gone into a tailspin. You know, as consumers deleverage, their assets shrink, their borrowings are shrinking in tandem, and it doesn't seem to be impacting consumption all that much as one might think, looking at the data. Although certainly individual instances differ.
Well, we'll come back to this question, but another cover of The Economist that we had recently turned the whole map of the Americas upside down and said who's on top now, and really highlighted the rise of Brazil in particular and of Latin America as a powerful economy. And I guess, you know, all this depression mentality here in America, for yourself accepted, you know, is very much in contrast with how the world economy looks, I think, from emerging economies or the non-traditional wealthy economies. And Vladimir, I wonder, you know, how you see what's going on and what the challenges are for the global economy.
First of all, you mentioned in Brazil. Brazil, it seems to me, one of the most promising market of 21st century. It's a country in progress, in ethnic stability despite of all diversity. It demonstrates very resistant economy toward crisis. In terms of global economy, I would like to say that no one multilateral institutions say, sorry, we did not predict this crisis. And if you will go and to see by law of World Bank, IMF, WTO, they have no line in their abilities that they have to predict and monitor potential global crisis. So first of all, this situation clearly indicates that we need new, small, but efficient global monitoring agency, which will monitor any signals of potential crisis. Second of all, what this crisis showed on global marketplace, that our rating agencies all together, Moody's, Fitch, say too, but everybody, failed to make real rating for companies. Lehman Brothers, 2 weeks before it failed, got AAA. It means we need to create independent multilateral rating agency which will be not allowed to get fees for consultations like all other rating agencies now doing, and they're compromised because of that. Third, why this global crisis is finishing so fast? We are now seeing that several countries demonstrate already pretty fast growing economy. In general, global economy is going up for 2 or 3 reasons. First reasons, current global crisis, which many people think it's first, in fact, it's a second one. First one was wrongly called Asian crisis, which started in 1997 in Thailand, Malaysia, then Japan, India, Russian ruble failed in 1998, and it finished in December 2001 with failure of national currencies in Argentina and Brazil. But at that crisis, clearly showed that governments were not ready because everybody lived under the impression that market will solve all problems by itself. That crisis, wrongly called Asian, clearly showed that age of romantic capitalism is finished and government required to be involved in preventing destruction of all economies under influence of one. American market started to fail, and because there was no restriction, no borders, no international multilateral institutions which stop this crisis on the national borders, it destroyed majority of national markets. So nonetheless, market crisis finishing pretty fast. The reason is involvement of national government. They're doing right or wrong. They immediately react or slowly, but they started to react on cash values, on regulations, many things. And what is important to understand that current global crisis showed that we need partnership between multilateral institutions, governments, and private businesses. It has to be mutual order to stop. Finally, the most important power behind current rate of growth of global economy, it's a global emerging market. It's about 83 countries which form this global emerging market, which is part of global marketplace. Among global emerging markets economies, which used to be looking up on developed countries, but now they not only cooperates with them, this global emerging market, not only cooperates with developed countries, they are competing with them. They are buying properties in developed countries, and obviously they are open for foreign investors from developed world. More than that, what's happened during couple of last years, developed countries lost a lot of investment capability, and some emerging market countries, especially like China, like India, like Brazil, which you asked, they started to invest in other emerging market countries, and so successfully that they won over developed countries in these emerging markets. It's what I can answer.
Excellent. Now, one question before I think the Prime Minister has introduced it. Louise, are you about to introduce it? Yeah. One question, you talked about the role of government increasing.
Right.
And I think a number of people here say, well, actually, that's the next crisis that we've already seen in Greece, the start of a sovereign debt crisis that may actually start to afflict many other nations. And so the idea that we've gone from this, what you call romantic capitalism of the market, to this more partnership-based with government, that in fact that model is also going to prove to be somewhat unsustainable because of the inability to raise money in the world economy.
But sovereign debt crisis did not appear yet, except a couple of countries of European Union. The problem on the global marketplace is lack of investment. Why? Because global marketplace appeared. It's not anymore 25, 23 developed countries. Now a lot of countries created economic conditions which are welcome foreign investors. Foreign investors started to go. They're looking for currency. Governments getting money, giving it private businesses. And what's happened now? Sovereign debt is high in many countries. But if you will see, even in countries where sovereign debt is low, like in Russia, for example, only 4%, debt of private businesses increased tremendously. So it's not easy to get rid of government. Government has to be part of a partnership with private businesses and multilateral institutions.
Well, I now want to ask up on stage the person who's the reason we're all here today, Louise.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I wouldn't be here if you weren't here. So we all share a part of trying to change the world partly with our voices. I would like to introduce now His Excellency Jan Pieter Balkenende. Sorry about my accent, it's not very good. He is the Prime Minister of Netherlands. You have probably heard him in the past. He has been a guest here for a few years. I would say that if one is the Prime Minister of Netherlands, they should be very, very proud. They have an unemployment rate of about 5%. The last quarter was growing at 3.6% for their GDP. And with a population of 16.7 million. And in terms of their public debt, if we compare their debt to other debt in Europe, you have Italy at 150%. That represents the debt percentage to GDP. Greece is at a level of 113%. France is at 78%. Portugal, 77%. Germany, 72%. And the Netherlands are at 62%, so bravo. So I will let the Prime Minister come up and engage in this dialogue, and I'll let Matthew take care of the rest. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Prime Minister, please come up and join us.
Ladies and gentlemen, first I have to apologize that I'm a bit late. We had the official lunch for the heads of government, and it took some time. I missed my dessert, but that's not so terrible because you eat a lot when you're in New York, besides all the meetings, because it's a very busy schedule, and that starts early in the morning and it finishes at the end of the evening. And also I have to apologize because I was interrupting your discussion. So if you allow me, I want to say some things. Okay? Ladies and gentlemen, it's really an honor to be here today to introduce the theme of recession and recovery. And if you'll permit, I would like to suggest that this afternoon we focus more on recovery than on recession. I think we know enough about the recession side of the story. And it started with the fall of Lehman Brothers on the 15th of September in 2008. I happened to be here at the Blouin Creative Leadership Summit only 10 days later, in 2008. Everyone was talking about the collapse of Lehman. They were shocked and alarmed, but even then, we could hardly imagine that its impact would be so dramatic, so historic. As we now know, this event triggered a global financial and economic crisis. Governments were forced to give cash injections running into billions to prevent an economic and financial meltdown. When credit dried up and demand fell, businesses struggled to keep their heads above water, and many went under. Ordinary people's jobs, homes, and pensions were at risk. That was the situation after the start of the financial and economic crisis. And the aftermath was high unemployment in the US and Europe, about 10%. Louise Blaine already mentioned that the Netherlands is a bit an exception. We are a bit lower than 5%. That is, compared to other countries, low. But what you see in Europe, that the level is much, much higher. And in many countries, public finances were thrown completely out of balance. Louise Blaine spoke about the debt rate, the state debt rate in the Netherlands. There's now a bit more than 60%. But before everything started in 2008, we expected that we would reach the lowest point of state debt ever. So things have really changed in a rather short time. And the question now is, what can we do? What does the road to economic recovery look like? The road to a sustainable and balanced recovery. And I should firmly add, because only a sustainable and balanced recovery can prevent future imbalances in our economic system. Only a sustainable and balanced recovery will enable us to combine economic growth with measures to tackle other global challenges, to combat climate change, to maintain biodiversity, to fight international terrorism, to resolve migration issues, and to find a response to the major shortages of natural resources, oil, gas, food, and water. There are two dimensions to this theme: short-term recovery and measures to bring about a sustainable long-term recovery. Let us take a brief look at each dimension. The current debate on short-term recovery revolves around whether our vulnerable economies need further stimulus or whether it is time for governments to withdraw because the private sector can once again play its natural role as the engine of economic growth. Opinions on what we should do vary widely. I'm sure that applies to you too. And that's understandable. After all, there's no such thing as one truth or one answer. The differences between countries, or rather between their citizens' behavior, are simply too big. For example, Dutch companies and citizens get uncomfortable if their government runs up an enormous debt and makes it bigger by continuing to spend regardless. If that happens, they keep a tight hold on the purse strings, companies invest less, and ordinary people save more. They are well aware that sooner or later they will pay the price for that government's runaway spending in the form of higher taxes and higher contributions towards healthcare, education, and pensions. They will only start spending again in a climate of economic certainty and financial stability. In America, things are different, as you probably know better than I do. So this is why, in my country at least, I argue for budget discipline, reforms, and a reduction of government deficits in both the short and the long term. I fully agree with Olivier Blanchard and Carlo Cottarelli, chief economist and head of fiscal affairs at the IMF, that we should not become obsessed with short-term policy. They recently wrote an article in the Financial Times entitled "The Great False Choice, Stimulus or Austerity." And they conclude, and I quote, "But more important are measures that improve the long-term fiscal outlook in those countries with high deficits and debt. This is where governments should focus their efforts. For without long-term fiscal reforms, lasting recovery is doomed far more certainly than if the world gets 2011 plans wrong by a fraction of a % of GDP. In other words, the long-term measures are the surest route to sustainable recovery. So let us focus on these above all. And if you ask me what I think is crucial to make our world, our economies, and our lives more stable, more sustainable, and more dynamic in the future, I can sum up the answer in one word: values. And that is not a strange story, because the times when I've been here at the Blouin Foundation, we constantly talked about that issue, the role of values. Also this morning, when President Obama gave his speech, he underlined the importance of values in society. 2 weeks ago, on the website of the New York Times, I read an analysis by Thomas Friedman that struck a chord with me. Let me give you an idea of his central message. He wrote, and I quote, "We had a values breakdown, a national epidemic of get-rich-quickism and something-for-nothingism. Wall Street may have been dealing the dope, but our lawmakers encouraged it. And far too many of us were happy to buy the dot-com and subprime crack for quick prosperity's height. China and India have been catching up to America not only via cheap labor and currencies. They are catching us because they know how free markets like we do, education like we do, access to capital and technology like we do, but, most importantly, values like our greatest generation had. That is, a willingness to postpone gratification, invest for the future, work harder than the next guy, and hold their kids to the highest expectations. In a flat world where everyone has access to everything, values matter more than ever," unquote. And of course, we need to reform our economic, tax, and financial systems to make them more robust and better able to withstand future challenges. For example, by raising our retirement age, making the labor market more flexible, and improving supervision in the financial sector. But a successful future demands another fundamental reform: a greater moral awareness, globally, nationally, in business, and among ordinary people. And let me outline what I mean. Globally, I hope that we can further intensify our current international cooperation, in good times and bad. When the crisis was deepest, the G20 assumed a prominent role and declared itself the premier forum for economic cooperation. It certainly lived up to that promise, as I know from personal experience. It launched a framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth, which I applaud. But it's only a framework. What matters now is to fill in the detail and to harmonize our policies in practice. The G20 is still struggling with its ambition of truly sustainable and balanced growth. The issue of scarcity seems to have faded from view because of the crisis. But I predict that if the G20 ignores it, it will surely be back on the agenda in a few years. And this is why I say, now is the time to take our moral responsibility by taking concrete action to tackle climate change, for example. The climate summit in Cancun is an excellent opportunity to make real progress. National governments also have their part to play. The lessons of this crisis are harsh. There are no two ways about it. We owe it to the next generation to introduce structural reforms, to exercise proper stewardship and put public finances back in order, to act now to address the problem of demographic aging so that our children are not left to sort it out, to ensure that the financial sector first and foremost serves the real economy, the business community, and the general public. Businesses have their own responsibility here. And I'm not only talking about banks. People who line their own pockets, excessive bonuses, perverse incentives, short-termism, reckless risk-taking, as we've seen and still see, unfortunately, this kind of thing is not unique to the financial sector. In my view, we can achieve sustainable recovery and growth only if businesses and business people behave more responsibly, if they go much further in embracing corporate social responsibility, not because terms like green or sustainable or socially responsible are good for their image and boost sales, but because they really do feel a long-term responsibility for the world in which they operate and for their role in it. And finally, of course, ourselves, ordinary citizens. We too will have to be guided more by moral principles in the future, by standards and values, the value of saving, the value of social engagement, the value of caring for others, These are the kind of values that, to use Friedman's words again, matter more than ever. Without moral awareness, there can be no sustainable recovery. So let us continue resolutely on the road to recovery, without running away from our responsibilities, not in the short term and certainly not in the long. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, and thank you for joining us for this discussion. I just wanted to, first of all, raise the question that I think a lot of people here in America have asked about Europe and the sort of sovereign debt issues that came up earlier in the year. Is Europe out of the woods there now? Is that problem being addressed?
I must say the issue of sovereign wealth funds and its implications, it's not at the hardcore discussion at the moment. Because I entered here, I can imagine the issue. But I must say, during the last months, we've had other discussions. When you talk about the European context, what were the issues? That had to do with the situation in Greece, the risk in Spain and Portugal and Ireland, the value of the euro, the situation of unemployment. That's the hardcore of discussion and not this issue. I have to be honest with
you. Do you feel that the Greece question has been resolved, the issue of Ireland?
Well, to talk about Greece, there were two problems. The first problem, and maybe you discussed about that, the first was that they used the wrong statistics. That was unacceptable. And I think if you are part of the European Union, it's unacceptable that you are not giving the right figures. You cannot work on that. So therefore, it's important that Eurostat, that's the statistics office, gets more competences. That's good. That's the first thing. The second point is that a country like Greece refused to reform. They did not take the right measures. And we learned from that. I'm a prime minister that for years is saying we have to respect the Stability and Growth Pact. You have to bring down the budget deficits, and it's better to have a situation in surplus. You have to bring down the state debt level, also in order for the future and the interest of the future generations. And what you can see now in Europe is that we've become more strict. There is a working group in the presidency of Herman Van Rompuy, the president of the European Council, saying we have to implement the pact much better than in the past. And I think that is in any case an advantage of it. So the problems are not away in Greece, but they are taking the right steps. And you can see that the whole, it's my last remark, the whole discussion about Europe has changed, because a few months ago people said the economy is recovering, in any case in the Far East. They're doing well with high growth figures. The US economy always has its own dynamics, and Europe has problems. At this moment, you can see the German economy is doing well, our economy is doing well, the euro has a better performance. So I think the discussion now is a bit different than, let's say, 6 or 7 months ago.
And you think the worst is behind us?
I think so, yeah.
Then you talked about climate change and the Cancun summit. I mean, are you optimistic about that? Because very few people I talk to really expect much to come out of that.
Well, optimistic or pessimistic, I think we are obliged to show progress. I remember, it's so strange, let me give an example. I was in the palace of the Queen of Denmark last year, and you are there with all the heads of government, kings, princes, excellencies. You're all together there. And then I thought, if everybody's there, all the world leaders, and we are together in Copenhagen, and we are convinced that we have to show progress, and the end of the meeting was that it was disappointing, it was a bit of shame. And now we have Cancun, and I'm realistic enough to know that it will be very difficult to have a binding agreement. So if it's not possible to have a binding agreement, in any case, you have to take the concrete steps. But in any case, we must avoid the situation that we have meeting after meeting without showing results. And we've seen that also with the WTO. I remember we had the G20 meeting in London, and then we said to each other, next year, in 2010, we will finish the discussion about WTO. And we failed to do so. And I think we are living in a time that we are obliged to show progress. And therefore, I really hope that also the world leaders, that also Council President Obama, President Hu Jintao, and others, that we feel ourselves responsible for the future of this earth. And therefore, I really hope that it will be possible to show progress, that we can take concrete results if a binding agreement is not possible. But if we would have the same sentiment in Cancun as we had in Copenhagen, then it's a risky affair.
One last question before I turn to some of the other panelists. You're here in part because of the Millennium Development Goal Summit. And again, that's an area where there's been a lot of talk, but less progress than we would have hoped.
Yeah.
What are you taking away from the discussions you've had this week? Are they making you more optimistic?
When you are talking about MDGs, I think in several fields you can see there is progress. When we talk about the quality of drinking water, education, death of children, there are developments that are going in the right direction. There are two areas that leads to problems. That has to do with the equal rights of men and women. That's MDG 3. And MDG 5 is also problematic when we talk about the death of young mothers. And that is a serious problem because if mothers die, it's terrible for the families in the first place. But it's also a very risky affair for the process of development. And everybody who knows something about development cooperation knows that you cannot have development without the role of women. So if women dies because of they are pregnant, it is a terrible situation. And so in these two MDGs we have still difficulties. And on the other hand, I must say there is progress. And we should feel obliged to do more in the next 5 years. I think there are chances, and we have to do it. It's also a matter of responsibility and values to bring the realization of these MDGs forward.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to Richard Robb. I want to turn to some of the discussion that we had this morning about the US economy and how there is a real fear that American politics has become so dysfunctional and the kind of debt burden that the government is building up has become so large that the only way out of this is going to be inflation and a return to sort of bad economic policy. How do you look at that question?
Okay. The question, if the U.S. were to, let's suppose by the end of next year, debt to GDP in the United States reaches 70%, which is about where it's headed. For the U.S. to try to inflate its way out, let's say we go for 7% inflation for 3 years. The average maturity of our debt is 5 years. So what you would achieve by doing that, if you, and about 10% of our debt is inflation adjusted, so there's no benefit to inflating our way out of that. About 1/3 of it is treasury bills. So you can't inflate your way out of treasury bills because interest rates go up 1 for 1. So if you make all those adjustments, you'll find that 3 years of 7% inflation reduces debt to GDP by 3%. It's not worth it. It's not, so I just don't think there's any incentive to see the U.S. seek to inflate its way out of its debt. There's its chances that our options are taxing to pay it back or rescheduling it.
I mean, do you share the gloom that there is a real structural problem in America that politically Congress is particularly likely to be a more divided Congress even after the midterm elections, that it's just not going to be capable of wrestling with these questions of how do you raise taxes or cut entitlements and all that sort of thing? I'm going to turn to Donald about
I don't know the answer. Ask Donald.
Yeah.
Maybe
But I mean, what's your instinct? Donald.
Oh, okay, we're going to let him off the hook.
I will, but I'll bring him back.
Okay. So I'm one of those divided government works the best for the United States kind of guys. I view it as tamping down on the worst of both sides and sometimes bringing out the best. The challenge is that, from now having spent 10 years in Washington, is that people are getting increasingly good about looking ahead to the next election, and so you only get a little window, right? So regardless of how the election turns out, there'll be a little window in 2011 where, in principle, people's better natures can come forward and they can try to achieve things legislatively. But then fairly quickly you end up in the shadow of the next presidential election and jockeying for a position and saying, hey, we'll deal with things after the next election. So I'm constitutionally an optimist, and I like to think that kind of under the odd-numbered year theory that in 2011 that Congress will undertake some good things. But that hasn't worked that well in the previous odd-numbered years.
I mean, particularly, I mean, you articulated in your first remarks that you want fairly radical reform of the tax system, the entitlements are out of control. I mean, that kind of agenda is very hard to reconcile with a divided government, isn't it?
Well, I think ultimately, actually, you need both parties, or all three parties, kind of Democrats, Republicans, Independents. You need some way for actually all of them to link arms and kind of step off the cliff together. So there's a benefit to having divided government when you want to pursue that. And if you look around, there are leaders on both sides of the aisle who I think sincerely want to address these issues. Right. The challenge is getting the critical mass to do it. And as your question suggests, it's hard to see the path forward at the moment that gets us that critical path.
And it certainly seems to me that one of the lessons the Republicans have drawn, the Democrats drew from '94 and Clinton, was that he should move to the middle and do a deal, a bipartisan deal. But the lesson the Republicans have learned is really don't do a deal with the president, because actually that allows them to get reelected. And so I wondered, what would actually trigger that linking of the arms? Does it require there to be some real sense of the crisis having got materially worse to really provoke that kind of...
So the old story among budget geeks was all we need is a crisis, and then a crisis will be the impetus for us to get our act together. And unfortunately, the world dealt us a big, giant honking crisis, and we went the other direction. It is difficult. Back in the Clinton years, people worried about debts and deficits in part because, the famous James Carville quote about wanting to be reincarnated as the bond market. People were following interest rates and worrying about it. And, that signal at the moment is signaling borrow as much as you want. And that's, a reflection of a weak economy and the fact that the U.S. still, knock on wood, remains a fine place to invest your money. You'll get it back. I think we need some impetus that is going to force us to do this. And hopefully it isn't an actual crisis, but just a perception of the prospect of crisis.
Richard?
All right. The U.S. is running a trade deficit of $500 billion a year right now. And we're selling, if we stopped making treasury bonds, what are we going to sell to the rest of the world? The crisis could come in, if there's going to be a crisis, it could be a collapse of the dollar, because it's unsustainable to have 5% of GDP year after, which we've had 5 or 6 years in a row of current account deficits. So I would see a decline in an increase in tax, a decline in the deficit, and a decline in the dollar all coming at the same time, and that will probably be the crisis that will get us going again.
Mark, how do you view these questions?
Ask me more precisely, please.
Well, as a businessman, do you feel that Washington is a huge problem at the moment, that the inability to get to grips with a growing deficit, this argument about whether to renew the Bush tax cuts or not seems to agitate a lot of business people. There's an underlying sense that all these entitlements have to be reduced. People looking across the world at Britain and this new government in Britain that really seems to have come in with a determination to reduce the size of the state by a fifth over the next 5 years. Dramatic, I guess. The Dutch have done something similar prior to the crisis. We've got Sweden about to elect a conservative government. Other parts of the world seem to be getting to grips with these problems in government and the unsustainability of public finance much more effectively than anyone seems to think America is going to do, where the consensus view I hear is that everything's gone horribly extreme. It's the Tea Partyists versus the left of the Democratic Party, and the congressmen don't want to be bipartisan, and this is really worrying the business people as they look at Washington.
The answer is that many people in the United States and outside the United States have from time to time in the past made the mistake of betting against the United States. I believe that would be a mistake again. We were promised, President Obama was elected on the promise of a post-partisan regime in Washington, D.C., and guess what? It didn't happen. And we could sit here and debate for hours why it didn't happen, but it didn't happen, and I think it didn't happen because of the nature of the occupants of Capitol Hill, if you will. That's about to change, and it's either going to get better, that is to say, depending on the outcome of the November elections, we either will have bipartisan cooperation, or it's going to get worse, and there's going to be complete gridlock. Now, there are many of my counterparts as leaders of large companies who would find the idea of complete gridlock in Washington, D.C. a good thing so we could get about our business. I'm not one of those people. I think that, that bipartisan cooperation is essential to getting us out of this mess, if you will. And in the meantime, we're not doing so badly. And I would kick the ball down to the far end of table for the infrastructure view.
Well, yeah, I'll bring you in. Do you feel, I'm going to put the same sort of rather long question to you. How do you feel about Washington?
I'm in the same place. I think it's part of the beauty of democracy that there's insanity from time to time, and I think great things get created, and I think there are terrible moments, and we all feel distressed, and we all worry about the extremists, but we end up finding a way to fix the problems. It's happened in the past, and I think most of my colleagues feel the same way, where we'll get to the right place, and it may be on Fox TV or it may be on the competing channel, but we'll get there.
But do you not feel the insanity is growing rather than receding at the moment?
No, you just get more of it on TV. It's always been there.
I hope you're right. Vladimir, as you, as a representative of the outside non-American world, I mean, do you think the view of the rest of the world of America and America's prospects has been, dramatically changed by events of the last couple of years? And do you think the rest of the world is starting to feel that America's getting its act together again and getting back on the road? Or do you think people still feel pretty gloomy about America?
America is still economic and not only political or military superpower. America produces huge part of global product. But at the same time, on the global marketplace appeared new group of countries, which I said emerging market countries, which together producing bigger part of global GDP than America or European Union. Banking assets in emerging market countries now bigger than in European Union or in America. Also, what is interesting to say, America always was leading country in terms of science development and education. We were all blamed America for brain drain. But now brain drain changed directions. For example, I am quite often now in South Korea. South Korea getting a lot of professors from America. They established program of education. Also, current crisis shows that more country invested in science, then more businesses invested in science, educational institutions invested in science, not just in education, and government. Then more country resistance to the power of crisis. The best examples is South Korea and Israel. They have highest level of part of national budget going to science, and their GDP didn't decline. America has to demonstrate new leadership in science and education. In fact, it didn't happen.
One of the challenges that people talk to me a lot about is, how is America going to create good jobs for average households? That, although Richard is right that America is one of those economies that both creates and destroys lots of jobs, and a lot of jobs have even been created in the last couple of years. Clearly the trend that was obscured by the housing bubble and the way houses became ATMs was that essentially the average household's income in real terms has been flat for a decade or more. And so America does seem to have this problem in creating quality jobs. I think in Europe there are similar problems, certainly in terms of some European economies. What can we do? How can we actually change that? Is it about investing in science and education, or is there something that can be done in the shorter term as well? I don't know, Prime Minister, do you have a view?
Maybe I can give first a reflection on what has been said. You mentioned the word next elections. And I'm convinced that if you use the word next elections at a moment when you have to realize reforms, then you will fail. And I'm saying this also after my experience during my second cabinet. We had a policy of reforms, reforming public health, reforming social security, reforming the pre-pension facilities, meaning that people could retire earlier than they were 65. We were convinced that we had to change things. There was criticism of the unions, there were demonstrations, economists were saying, you are ruining our economy, and we were convinced that we had to change things. And in 2006, people said, you've taken the right step, so you need political courage. So you mustn't think in terms of the next elections, you have to think in terms of what's necessary for my country, that's one. The second point, you spoke about the bipartisan cooperation. I must not interfere in American politics, that's none of my business. But we had the problem that when we start as a government with the proposals for restructuring, for reforms, the unions, the organization of employees, they were very critical. But after the first struggles, then there was a kind of cooperation. And despite the criticism in the beginning, afterwards, we were able to have 3 or 4 social agreements. So criticism in the beginning, but afterwards they also underlined the fact that we had to change parts of social security and we had to change the pre-pension facilities. So, of course, when you talk about bipartisan cooperation, that's your responsibility here. But our experience shows that if there is a kind of cooperation, you need some support, and that happened in my country. And third element, you spoke about taxes. The traditional struggle in Europe is always between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats. The Social Democrats do not like to work on savings. They prefer to increase taxes. And the Christian Democrats say, you have to save, you have to bring down the government expenditure. And why? Just because of the fact that you cannot have a too high level of government expenditure as percentage of the GDP. Because in the long run, you will have the negative consequence of that. So you must have the courage to bring down things like state debt, budget deficit, and so on. And I think if you have a clear agenda, then you can reach it. I'm making these remarks because of the fact you talk about creating jobs. When I started as Prime Minister in 2002, we were walking behind in Europe. We were not satisfied about the flexibility of the labor market. And what happened? Because of the reforms, because of the other view on social security, people started more to have jobs. Local authorities, in the beginning, they only gave social benefits. But now they are working on giving people jobs. So it has been another attitude. Creating jobs is a matter of how do you structure your social security system. Does the system have incentives for people to work? And not a traditional welfare state concept. The second point is you must talk in terms of innovation. What are the strong features of your economy? What is the quality of education? And I'm convinced that if you are doing these things in the right way, then you can create jobs. And of course, you have to focus in which sectors can you be strong. The Netherlands, we always had a very strong agricultural sector. We are good in service, the financial sector. So you have to define in which sectors you can operate. So it is a combination of, I think, the social security system. Does it have incentives? And I know that in the US is completely different than in Europe. I'm aware of that. So that's one element. The other element is you have to define the sectors in which you are very strong. And you must have a good education system. And then I think it's possible to have the right jobs. I can say more, but I'm speaking too long. That's the problem with politicians. If they have a microphone, they never stop talking. I have to apologize for that.
Good stuff, anyway. Richard.
I would agree wholeheartedly with the Prime Minister says, and what does not create growth, prosperity, and innovation is science. I mean, there's ample evidence. It didn't create it for the Soviet Union. It's not doing it for India. It doesn't matter where things are discovered. I'm sorry, this topic came up yesterday. The U.S. economy can absorb scientific discoveries that take place in other countries. And that's what creates why our productivity here in the 90s and the first part of the previous decade surged relative to other parts of the world, including the European Union, because we could absorb technology, much of which was invented here, much of which was not invented here, faster than other parts of the world. And if we don't lose our nerve, it'll happen again this time, but not through dedicating social resources to
so how do you account for the fact that it's really been a decade that America has gone without producing higher average household income?
Well, median household income, yeah. I mean, inequality of income has grown, which is an unfortunate consequence of technology and globalization. You know, it takes time and education, and all the things the Prime Minister listed are the things that we need, and it's not going to happen overnight.
Donald?
Well, so first on the data about household income. So again, right, so median household incomes have done virtually nothing over the last decade. A portion of that is because usually the way that's measured doesn't include the value of the health insurance they're getting from their employer. And part of what you've seen is the dramatic increase in healthcare costs has essentially squished down the amount of cash compensation that people get. And then in the long run, one of the things if we want Americans to have more take-home pay is we're eventually going to have to to invoke the common metaphor, bend the curve on healthcare costs, so that more of their compensation can go to lifting their incomes. And obviously, with the recent healthcare legislation, a few steps have been taken in that direction, but there's a lot more that the United States can do in that front. In the long run, if you have the opportunity to think about the long run, what's going to drive our prosperity in the long run, and it's human capital plus physical capital, right? And so the challenge is to, as everyone has said, right, to educate folks so that when they're young, they build up both the skills and the mental flexibility so that whatever the jobs are 20 years from now, which virtually no one can predict, they'll be in a position to do them well. And then the second is just to make sure that the United States remains a place where physical capital and financial capital are perceived as being welcome. And that's something where, frankly, I think the rest of the world has been trying to catch up with us and has been succeeding, and is a front where we may need to do some things to make sure that the capital feels welcome here.
But Joseph, as a businessman, how do you respond to this?
He's got it right on the money. Education, I think, is the foundation, and it's a huge problem in this country. And that probably could be a whole day worth of panels of how to restructure education in this country. But if we don't get there, we're not going to get the high-value jobs. We're not going to get the flexible labor market that we need.
How do you feel, some of this current administration's policies like race to the top and so forth on education are actually making a difference, or is it?
I think just it's a veneer, really. I think that the school systems that probably none of us get to see in Cleveland and St. Louis are in such enormous distress, they really need to be rethought radically, and I just don't think that agenda has yet hit the American people.
Mark? Again, the business perspective on how do we create good jobs, more jobs?
You actually were down at the other end of the panel in the right place. There needs to be a new commitment, and I don't think $50 billion is enough, quite frankly, to creating infrastructure for the greater good of everyone in order to get everybody back to work. And it's not, jobs are leaving faster than we're creating them at the moment. We need to be creating more jobs. The private sector is at the moment not in the sense of being deer in the headlights, but appropriately hesitant during this period of deleveraging to do the things that would be necessary to stimulate a lower unemployment rate. There is a place for government here. I believe it is in the sphere of encouraging infrastructure of all sorts, not just highways, bridges, hospitals, schools, et cetera. And when that happens, and again, we look back to the 1930s, that's the beginning of the way out of this. And as the government-sponsored programs begin to take hold, you'll see the private sector pile on in a favorable way, I think.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're almost out of time, and what I'd like to do is just to end, because so many discussions of economics and so forth nowadays are so depressing, by asking you each to tell us the one thing that you see out there that makes you most optimistic about economic recovery over the next couple of years. And I'm going to start with you, Vladimir.
The most optimistic that unemployment on global arena is decreasing. But at the same time, what I found out that unemployment among the most poorest part of population is not decreasing. And the main goal of government to distribute small money like microcrediting governmental money that entrepreneurs from most poor part of societies will implement and practice their ideas. Some countries doing very good with this. So this is a good example what other countries, including the United States, what they have to do.
Mark.
If one looks back to 1946 and remembers Senator J. William Fulbright and his view that this really is all about education, and I'm going to paraphrase, if we send enough of ours over there and bring enough of theirs over here, in each case for a sufficient period of time, we'll have a more prosperous and more peaceful world. He had it absolutely right. It applies to today's business circumstance in that there needs to be more, I'm using this word in the favorable sense, not in the negative sense, more globalization, more international cooperation, more international trust. Go back to President Obama's remarks in Cairo at the beginning of last year, I think. And you'll see that the political and the economic need to come together here because it's a global problem. It's not a US problem. It's not a European problem. It's not a developing world problem. It's everybody's problem. And we need to do a better job of doing it together. And the answer is all in education. This is not a short-term problem susceptible of a short-term solution. The trick will be to not lose a generation as we get from here to there.
Joseph, I just want to ask you what you see that makes you optimistic.
Well, we work in probably the stodgiest places in the economy, which is the Nebraska Department of Transportation, those kinds of places. And we're continually surprised about their struggle for innovation. I mean, they're all trying to figure out how do we do things. They've got a global mindset. They're trying to figure out how the Canadians are doing work. They're looking at the latest sustainable technologies to apply to infrastructure. Quite a bit of innovation going in the quietest places in America.
Great, Donald.
So I would say that one of the things you observe as we've gone through the economic downturn is that firms in many sectors of the economy have become much more productive. And that's something that's been bad for employment in the short run, but in the long run, the heightened level of productivity is something that will boost our prosperity.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the profitability recovery in America has been unprecedented in a recovery phase, isn't it? Richard?
Yeah, history teaches us that capitalism is like magic at times like this, and it's easy to lose your nerve, but it always finds a way of coming back, creating prosperity.
I'm going to give the last word to the Prime Minister. What makes you optimistic at the moment?
Well, I'm optimistic because I can see there is a shift in orientation at the moment. When I studied economic and social history and law. In the 70s, people talked about the role of the government, of the state. Every social problem was a political problem. Governments had to solve it. But that led to the crisis of the welfare state. And then things changed in the 80s. Then people talked in terms of now markets must have the room. And it's true, we need a more market-oriented approach. But we've seen also that it can go in the wrong direction. We've seen that in 2008. And today, people are saying we have to talk about values, about responsibility, because we need the market. I'm completely convinced. But when we go back to Adam Smith, he talked about the invisible hand in the economy. But people forget that 10 years before he wrote the book, The Wealth of Nations, he wrote the book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And he always underlined the fact you only can have an invisible hand in the economy if there is a moral component. And I have the impression that after the thinking in terms of the welfare state, in the 70s and the 60s, then the more classical orientation on freedom, markets and so on, that now we can say you need market approach, but you need the moral component. That should be on a much higher level. And the fact that Obama this morning spoke about values, the fact that companies are talking about corporate social responsibility, that gives me, I must say, an optimistic feeling.
Well, on that optimistic note, I'd like to thank you for your keynote and participating in this panel, and for all our panelists for giving us plenty of food for thought and reasons for going out with a bit more confidence into the world later this evening. So thank you very much.